Thank you so much to Bob and to Jing and to all of you for your attention. We really appreciate everyone's being here. I think the path forward is going to depend on collaborations, international, across boundaries. I think the community, the more we come together, the more we can accelerate progress. And this is a really inspirational event. So I'm delighted to continue the conversation and extend the topic that we discussed on the last panel by introducing really the fabulous group of folks that you see here on the slide behind you. And I'd like each one of you to come up and have a seat as I read your bios. And I'm going to be very, very brief in describing this. Each of the panelists has an incredibly long list of accomplishments, and I would not get you to lunch if I described all of their amazing activities and all their bios. So first is Mr. John Oyler, who's co-founder, CEO, and chairman of BeiGene. He has a long history as an executive in healthcare, leading biotech companies, very successful ones, and innovating drug development, technology development, with extensive impact on cancer. So please welcome Mr. Oyler. Thank you so much. Second, I'd like to introduce Jennifer Dent, who is president and CEO of BioVentures for Global Health. And I'll have her describe this organization in more detail, but essentially she is a convener. She brings communities together, public-private partnerships to try to accelerate progress in biomedical research, specifically cancer. So welcome to Jennifer. Third, we have representation on this panel of individuals from across multiple continents. Third, I'd like to introduce Dr. Adewole, who's Managing Director of Advanced Medical Services Limited from Nigeria. Welcome, Dr. Adewole. He is trained as a chemical pathologist, but he has led multiple organizations across Nigeria, building healthcare systems with incredible capacity for something that we haven't talked a lot about yet, but that is diagnosis. And you know, we've talked a lot about cancer treatment, but before we can treat cancer, we have to diagnose it. And he's really been a thought leader in getting patients diagnosed and getting them into the system across Africa with a focus on Nigeria. So welcome. Our fourth speaker is Dr. Stephen Clarke. So we at Memorial Sloan Kettering owe Dr. Clarke a specific debt of gratitude because he trained Dr. Bob Lee, who's such a wonderful member of our faculty and was responsible as an organizer of this event. So thank you for training Dr. Lee. Thank you for sharing him, and a special hand. Beyond his credentials as Dr. Lee's mentor, he is a medical oncologist and a senior physician professor at the Royal North Shore Hospital, which is the leading cancer care center in Sydney, Australia. So welcome, Professor Clarke. And finally, it is a distinct pleasure going to another continent and another hemisphere. It is a pleasure to introduce Dr. Paulo Nigro, who is CEO of the Sirio-Libanes Cancer Center, which is the preeminent cancer center in Brazil. So welcome. We're very happy to have you. So I think without further ado, I'm going to ask each of you, and perhaps we'll go in the order in which I introduced you. We heard on the previous panel about all of the challenges. We don't enroll enough patients in clinical trials. Clinical trials are too slow. We fail to act on the information. We fail to implement broadly the knowledge that we do gain. It takes too long. not only to get the trials done, but then to translate that information into the community. From your perspectives, what do we need to do differently? And how can we accelerate progress? And specifically, starting with the biotech sector, what should we do?
Sure. Well, that's a lot to answer in a very short period of time. Maybe some things that weren't mentioned that I think are really important. When I started BeiGene with my co-founder, Xiaodong Wang, I think our goal was we want to make medicines and do great science and help people. That's the goal. But I think our sense was there's a fundamental problem, not around science, the science is working, but around how do we do this in a way that's affordable? Because if it's not affordable, even when you do great science, if it only gets to 1/6 of the people in the world, that's disappointing. And it's not really, fulfilling all the hard work and energy that people put in to figure out how to make something that's really impactful. My co-founder's a great scientist, and he's like, the research is so expensive. And we don't talk too much about cost in this industry. But the truth is the research is nothing. When you look at a medicine, most small molecules or most antibody-based medicines, not CAR T, some things are different. But when you look at them, probably 75 to 90% of the cost of that medicine delivered to a patient is really about the clinical trial. It's shocking. When you look at clinical trial costs, when I got into the industry, people, an oncology trial was $100,000 per patient. That means every data point we're going to have to run statistics on was $100,000 a patient. Most of my fellow CEO colleagues of small biotech companies, today say that number's $275,000 to $300,000. And that's an average cost. It's not a cost if you're running a trial with a very expensive comparator. We've run a trial with a comparator that we spent $100 million buying the comparator medicine to even be able to run the trial, which is added to the number. So, when you look at this and you say, how do we, make clinical trials really functional? I think a piece of it is, and how do we make great medicines? A piece of it is how do we make this affordability through clinical trials? I think that, the 5% of patients in the world, I don't even know if it's that high. I actually think the number's smaller. I think it's 5% in the US. But it probably is right because other people are saying it. But essentially, when you look at that, why is it so expensive? Because there aren't that many patients, and every pharmaceutical company, every new breakthrough and innovation is chasing those patients and the same resources to run those in very few clinical centers. When we started BeiGene, I think our goal and belief was if we want to impact and make medicine affordable and make it more available to people all around the world, and in the US, because 3 out of 8 people in the US can't make their copayment for oncology medicine. How do you do that? You really have to completely focus on clinical trials. So we built a biotech company not unlike others, trying to do great research, trying to ultimately bring medicines to patients. But the goal was, how do we really change clinical trials? We've tried to do that 3 ways. The first thing is, all clinical trials, like their manual double entry of data, it's like when you look at the way we actually execute in a technology savvy world, we're not a decade behind. We're like 40 years behind in being efficient in the way we collect information. So we tried to look at this with technology. But the second thing is, if you wanted to change your cost structure, you can't have every company and every clinical trial enrolling every patient at Memorial Sloan Kettering or some of the other best hospitals in the world. There's not enough patients there. you need to include a lot more centers all around the world and work more actively and bring them into the clinical trial center. So instead of having, whether it's 5% or less, patients, you have 10% or 15%. So to us, it was, how do you be much more inclusive and find a way to work with centers that haven't done as many clinical trials to dramatically change the cost structure? And in doing that, we actually started in Australia, actually in Melbourne, not Sydney, because it was the fastest place from a regulatory perspective to start trials, and because it was 40% of the cost of running a trial in the United States, and we were poor. We had no choice. We did. And by the way, the KOLs we worked with were outstanding. They're spectacular.
They're even better in Sydney, actually.
Sydney, we do a lot of later stage work, but the early phase 1 work, a lot of the centers, for whatever reason I don't understand, I was saying this earlier, there need to be more phase 1 centers in Sydney. But we started largely in Melbourne and other places, but we did this because it was affordable, and we became one of the largest, probably the largest oncology clinical trial sponsor in Australia. We have 220 people in Australia largely doing clinical trials today. The third piece we did is we got rid of the CROs that sit in the middle of the industry. And part of the reason we got rid of the CROs was we couldn't adopt our own technology, and we couldn't go to centers we wanted to easily because a lot of the CROs worked at a set number of centers, and the incremental cost of going to the next one was really, really expensive. So just, I think our perspective is, if we want to be great in getting medicine to patients and solve that broader thing, if we want to run many clinical trials and get the best medicines and answer the scientific questions we need to, are they safe and efficacious, as quickly as we can, it's all about changing clinical trials in being far more inclusive, using better technology, and going to places that others haven't. In Brazil, we're quite active, and I think we've hired about 24 people to do clinical trials there just recently. We're trying to get to Nigeria and to other places too. But basically at this point, we have about 3,000 people all around the globe running clinical trials and trying to bring more and more centers into this process, trying to have better technology to ensure quality and to help centers without as much experience do things. And the cost of a clinical trial, in Australia, Korea, China, it's 40% of the US. A cost in Latin America, it's even less. And from that perspective, really our view is, if we want to bring medicine affordably to patients all over the world, and we're doing that. We're launching our medicines more affordably than other medicines. We're putting our money where our mouth is. But when you want to do that, you have to completely change this whole system. And I think we have to all work very closely together. And the policy point is what I've learned in the last 10 years. The policy can make things infinitely more efficient, or they can make them infinitely slower and more problematic and more costly from that perspective. So I think that's the piece of clinical trials that we think we all need to work on together as an industry. Change that 5% number to 10% or 15%. But in doing that, we also have to really reach out all across the globe. And this is what we need if we want affordable medicine in the US. Economically, this is a global issue. You can't have affordable medicine brought quickly to patients and developed if you're working in separate ecosystems, because the costs are lower if you're global. And ultimately, if you think 75 to 90% of the cost of a medicine is the upfront cost of a clinical trial, that means it's not cost of goods sold. So, Jesus, once you've figured out it's safe and efficacious, why can't we find out how to economically get these medicines to as many, many people as we can around the world? And it does require different things. IV is not going to work in a lot of countries. You need low-cost sub-Q solutions from that perspective. There aren't IV centers. when you really start to define the problem you're trying to solve much more broadly, we do need to change a lot of things on the way. So anyway, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you so much, John. That was great. So Jennifer, let's hear from you. And I would just say I would encourage all panelists, this issue of affordability in drug development or treatment development is so critical that hopefully everyone can reflect on that from your own perspectives.
Sure. Thanks very much. And so the organization that I represent, BioVentures for Global Health, when the organization was launched 20 years ago, we focused on infectious diseases, but coming from a background working in the private sector and specifically with a company that was working in oncology, starting to talk to leaders in the countries that we were working in, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, about the rapidly changing shift to non-communicable diseases, started to think about the fact that there was a demand for more research, better research in oncology, areas like oncology, and there was very little research going on the African continent. And there was also a demand for access. There was a demand and a need to participate in clinical trials, and recognizing that actually industry wants to play a role in African countries. Industry wants to be there, but sometimes they're challenged by finding the sites that have the capacity. And there's a huge amount of capacity on the continent. We heard from Aminu Umar Sadiq, who leads the Nigeria Sovereign Investment Authority, the investments they're making. We heard about oncology, but also in diagnostic capacity across the country. We'll hear from Dr. Tolu, but when we look at the African continent, we think about looking at what is there, what exists, not thinking about what doesn't exist. And so through some of the collaborations that we've launched and the partnerships that we're helping to coordinate and implement, we're actually kind of working at the country level. And I'll use Nigeria as an example where, the Director General of the an FDA equivalent agency, NAFDAC, in Nigeria, she's very committed to driving innovation and to working with academics, to working with companies, and she is working with the BeiGene team now and Memorial Sloan Kettering to move forward the study that Professor Luis Diaz spoke about, which I think is so exciting, that will take place at 2 sites in Nigeria launching next year. But working at the regulatory, with the regulatory agencies in these countries is something that we also recognize as critical. Supply chain, understanding what supply chain is, how it operates, the Ministry of Health, what their priorities are. It truly is bringing all of the agencies, the key stakeholders in countries together so that they're coordinated around, from the beginning, the design, the demand and the need and the interest at the hospital levels, understanding what capacity exists, what training is required, and using technology to make up for perhaps some of the more limited experience in conducting clinical trials. And we've done that through one project we're coordinating right now, which is, we have the NLCC site in Nigeria participating. We also have a site in Tanzania, in South Africa, and in Uganda. And this is an international consortium, a prostate cancer study, where there's a Saturday morning, and we're just speaking with Dr. Joseph, who's the lead PI at NLCC in Nigeria, about how she's on Zoom all the time and every Saturday for the consortium's meeting on troubleshooting, addressing issues, quality control for this study. And so it's using technology to make up for where perhaps the experience and skill isn't there, but creating the connectivity between centers like Memorial Sloan Kettering and other leading cancer centers. We actually have a center in Australia that's participating in one of the training programs in Nigeria that will happen next year. But it's really the connectivity and working from the ground up to understand, I think first and foremost, what do partners on the ground want to achieve? What are their objectives? What are their capacities? And then how do you pull together all of the stakeholders in those countries to make it as efficient as possible and to actually execute. And we heard about demonstration projects, and I think that that's absolutely critical. Getting started and diving in, because if you wait until you think you understand everything about a country like Nigeria, you're not going to be into that market for 10 years at least, probably. But there's amazing capacities in that country. And when you pick the right partners and you work with the right partners on the ground, it's amazing what you can get done.
Fantastic. Dr. Adewole, let's hear from you.
Thank you very much. Bob, we're grateful to be present here to sit on the table and talk about what's happening in Nigeria. And to BeiGene, I will just say this. Number one, we offer you a chance to reduce the time to get to the market. That's the first thing I'll be able to say. Now, if we dimension the issue why sub-Saharan Africa is underrepresented, there are three things: infrastructure, technology, and human capital. And so if you look at these three things, one of the things which we've been able to do at the NSIA Lung Cancer Center was through the Sovereign Wealth Fund, NSIA, invested money and cut a check, and you could put up infrastructure, both hard and soft, and then also invest in technology. And now with people like an organization like BVGH, we're able to memorialize Sloan Kettering. In fact, as we're here speaking, we actually have one of the attending physicians from the center doing a fellowship at MSK. And so these are the kind of things that bridge the gap. And there was a study for subacute Herceptin, which is the Harriet study with the University of Chicago, and they have been on that trial trying to recruit for almost 8 years, and they couldn't. But all of a sudden, by the time they came to us at the center, and within 6 months, we were able to recruit 60 people for them, and they were able to, even during COVID, and then from them, so with the study completed, clinical trial completed, the IPO-African trial that Jennifer just mentioned, we're almost done with that. And so you talked about going to Australia or Asia having the cost by about 40%. What I can guarantee you, if you come to sub-Saharan Africa, they'll probably do it for about 20%. And what that does is that it helps you, and then we have a clinic where in Lagos where we have 60 new patients coming in almost every week. And so recruitment and a population of 220 million. So, I mean, you can bet that. So what that shows is that with collaboration, we'll actually get faster and be able to treat people, and people then be able to benefit. Because the other side of it is that then there will be a lot more pressure on the West, because then people then need to bring their relatives, bring more people, take them or pull them from their comfort zone to try and see whether they'll be care. Or the other is that we've got people on the other side who are just falling off the cliff. And I think all of that, if we collaborate, then it makes life a lot easier, and then we can bring solutions faster to the market with diversity. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Clarke, let's hear your perspective. You've been in this space for a long time.
Oh, thanks. That means I'm old. I think I'd reiterate most of the points that have been made. And made earlier. I think the trial has to be applicable to the population that you're treating. So we did a study of some of our patients some years ago, looking at the applicability of the clinical trials that had been published to the patients we were seeing. And we found that only 30% of the patients we were seeing would have fitted the criteria for the clinical study. But the study results were being generalised to the total population, including older patients, less well patients, patients with less good performance status. So I think we need to make sure that whatever trials we undertake are applicable to the target population. I think dealing with new players is hard. We've undertaken some collaborative studies in Asia, and we didn't really understand some of the circumstances of the people there, and I think education and exchange of people is critical. But we found things like if patients treated in normal fashion, some of the remuneration for the clinician was linked to the normal treatment. So if you treated a patient on a study, they would get less remuneration. We found they didn't have research nurses a lot of the times, and that meant that the already busy clinicians and their registrars were having to undertake all the extra work for the trial, which was a real pain for them and reflective of the situation in parts of the US. We also found that some of the patients didn't like having their blood taken, and we were undertaking a pharmacokinetic study where we had frequent blood taking points, and the patients just didn't want to come at it. We also found that some of the countries didn't want things like DNA to leave that country, and so we then had to organise research partners to do the DNA studies. So I think understanding the local population and working with them and educating them and exchanging staff before you undertake clinical trials is critical. The other real issue was the whole ethics and consent process, which tended to be different to the way we undertook it, and also the audit processes that you need to bring in to make sure that everything is done appropriate to the way you would normally undertake things. So I think it's an ideal circumstance to roll out studies to other parts of the world and do the trials well, but we have to make sure that all the quality control mechanisms are there and that the trials are applicable to their populations.
Thank you so much. Hear from you.
Well, I can only resonate what you all have said. I think affordability is a real issue in our part of the world. If you think about Latin America, it's a very diverse continent. In Brazil alone is probably one of the most diverse countries in terms of population. We are a big melting pot. Europeans, Africans, Asian population. We have a big, for example, in São Paulo, a big concentration of Japanese people. So even the original population, we are a big mix. So from the clinical trial standpoint and addressing those minorities, we would be a fantastic place to run clinical trials. However, we are part of the 5%, John. We are totally underrepresented. And if you think what are the main reasons is probably when I see its lack of funding, governmental funding, and also from the private sector. And otherwise, as we heard about Nigeria, it would be a fantastic place to develop great clinical trials. We have, I'd say, advanced structure, physicians. Unfortunately, physicians, they ended up focusing on the clinical activity as well as opposed to research, because they cannot live with what the research would give them in terms of remuneration. So we do have all the conditions to develop a better profile. When we talk about precision medicine, for instance, we know that precision medicine is a great revolution when it comes to cancer care. However, the question I'd like to pose is it doing a good job in addressing minorities when it comes to clinical trials overall? I saw a JAMA network study that between 20 and 21 studies for solid cancer had 83% of the population coming from white people from developed countries. So I don't think it's clear if precision medicine is really precise as much as we want it to be. So putting more in an optimistic spin now, I really think that initiatives as Cure4Cancer, and Bob, congratulations, and for everybody that is supporting you in this initiative, could address this issue. Can you imagine the power of having Nigeria, Australia, Brazil, New York, all together, how many people we could squeeze into the right studies with the right cost and right profile. Yeah. So I think we are very enthusiastic about being part of this network. Can imagine also how much we can improve as providers if we improve the number of clinical trials and people. I think we will end up being a better institution because we will learn more how to deal with data. We'll be driving more, I'd say, our clinics, our treatments based on real evidences. So I think there is such a positive spin that we can put behind that. And as you said, we are ready for that. We are eager for that. Even from the regulatory standpoint, in Brazil, things have improved a lot during the last, I would say, 3 to 5 years. We have been shortening time to approve clinical trials. As you probably know, we have been also dealing with bureaucracy in a much better way. So we are ready to go. We need, say, to get more attention from the rest of the world and how we can make it happen. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask sort of 2 questions to the panel, and I think any of you should answer them, and then we'll turn it open to the entire group for, we want to have some time for Q&A and to engage everyone. I want to pick up on the regulatory theme, so we don't have a regulator on the panel, but I think, Jennifer, you touched on it, and one of the challenges and obstacles that often come up with respect to inclusive clinical trials and working across international boundaries is the regulatory framework and the regulatory requirements and how complex it can be to navigate. So each of you has a lot of deep experience in this. What do we need to do to come together to try to improve the regulatory structures? If we had the regulators right here, what would you want to say to them? What do they need to know? So anyone.
I think they actually do a pretty good job. And I think there is increased collaboration between the various regulatory agencies worldwide to try and deal with some of the issues and accelerate time to registration and in our country, reimbursement of drugs. I think some of the big issues they're probably not addressing are the control arms of some things, which might be the latest, best drug compared to some other drug. But if that control arm's not available in the majority of the world, that makes a real problem. And I don't think they've tried to address that probably as well as they could have to make sure that the control arm of any trial that sometimes is going to be paid for by the country or the unit itself rather than the trial is applicable to that country and able to be afforded in that country. So I think we should, and I think they're all increasingly happy to advise people coming through with new drugs as to what the appropriate trial design should be and how people can accelerate access for patients who need it. And I think, BeiGene's a new company, and we love dealing with them, and they've done very well in this instance, asking for advice from people about how to accelerate and improve the speed of registration.
Maybe I can just say, so we've actually worked very closely with the regulatory agencies in the countries in sub-Saharan Africa that we're working with, because we do see them as playing an absolutely critical role, not only for registering research and clinical trials, but also when companies want to register drugs or when drugs are coming into a country not registered. Is there a waiver, and understanding that system? So we've actually mapped the regulatory agencies and their fast track or their regular processes. But it also starts with having a discussion and understanding and respecting that there is sometimes more of a hierarchy in different countries. And so, for instance, I'll just use Nigeria as an example. The Director General, Professor Moji Adeyeye, she was a professor in the United States for more than a decade, I think almost 2 decades. She's very driven for clinical research to be conducted in Nigerians because she recognizes that patients are being treated with regimens where Nigerians have not been well represented at all in those to understand if those regimens are safe and efficacious. So, we actually have coordinated the initial discussion between the team at BeiGene, Memorial Sloan Kettering, and the sites in Nigeria that are participating. And just to start with those discussions with the regulatory agencies, because what we're seeing is they want to drive innovation, they will be flexible. We also, in conducting training with the regulatory agencies, we've been working with the US FDA, who are very keen to contribute their know-how and knowledge and to support regulatory agencies in developing more efficient but responsible approaches and skills and experience in actually reviewing clinical studies and making sure that they are appropriate and that they're regulated the way they should be. So I think it starts with a discussion, but also understanding, again, what those key agencies and stakeholders want.
I'll make two comments. The first comment is the reason that a lot of patients are excluded, and I didn't understand this until we were well on to our clinical trials, and I said, why don't we have more diverse patients? And the reason is, unless the regulators mandate broader inclusion, say of people with comorbidities, diabetes and obesity, for example, companies ultimately have to deal with other companies. And if they choose to include that patient population because there's comorbidity, they're going to have a safety profile that looks less favorable. So they're all in a catch-22 where no one's willing to do that. So this is an area where regulators have to take a leadership role and drag the industry to clear standards, because otherwise the players individually, they're too afraid to do the right thing. So you need regulation here. I feel that very strongly, and hopefully it's moving in that direction. From the other perspective, when you mentioned, Dr. Clarke, a lot of times the control arm isn't relevant in most of the world. I think we need to acknowledge we have a major problem. The major problem is most of the world follows the US or the EU regulatorily. You really can't get approved. That's not true for every country. BeiGene is trying with Brazil, trying with Australia, has succeeded in China to have their own path that's independent. But in general, you're gated by the US approval or the European approval. In general, the framework in the US is when a standard of care changes, so if chemotherapy is replaced by a much, much more expensive new treatment, no longer can another medicine be approved unless it runs against the very expensive standard. And that's hard to do because you have to pay for it and you have to run a big trial, and it's very good standard, probably. So it's a long trial and you have to be exceptional to be approved from that perspective. The problem in that scenario is it shuts a window for other medicines to be approved in the rest of the world. And these cutting edge medicines that are approved in the US and Europe that change the hurdle, they often cost here $15,000 a month or $20,000 a month. And when those medicines show up in Brazil or show up in Africa, they are not priced at any price they will ever be used by more than 1% of the population. And so we have this major problem in the industry, which is we're relying on the US and Europe to be the gatekeeper for new medicines. But the most cutting edge new medicines that are developed are priced out of these markets and impractical. And they may also be impractical because you don't have a center that could provide that type of treatment. So there's a big structural problem right now in the industry because the US regulators it's not in their venue to care. They care about the US. But the unintentional consequence of that is it really prevents a whole set of other medicines that could be much more affordable or much more appropriate in many, many places of the world from getting there. So either we need the development of an alternative regulatory path that doesn't rely on the US and Europe, or we need the US and Europe regulators to understand that they're the gatekeepers for the rest of the world, and they have a responsibility because whether they are intended to or not, de facto, they are the approval process to get more affordable and more useful medicine to 2/3 of the world's population that can't, take this cutting-edge treatment the way it's being delivered to them today. It's a big structural problem, and I don't think we talk about that enough, but we should.
Okay, just to say 2 or 3 things. When we listened to, was it Paul, the guy that was in charge of FDA, OCE? So one of the things he mentioned was, I said, look, by the time he started, there were only 30 drugs. I said, and there were a team of less than 10. He said, now they've got 100 or so, and they're trying to see how they can have equity. And equity participation from other parts of the world would be how to liberalize access. That's what is going to boil down at the end of the day. Now, if Jennifer remember, we were at ASCO, and the WHO representative for oncology was there, and he made a statement. He said 40% of all the fake drugs globally comes from trying to make generics of oncology treatment. And that's something that is significant, because if you talk about Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, where it is out of pocket, then what they're going to get, they're going to be victims of this 40%. So until FDA takes that ownership, leadership, and responsibility to see how do we liberalize access by making alternate molecules faster to come to the market. And again, like I said to BeiGene, when you do your clinical trials diversified and you have the cost of coming to market less than $1 billion, maybe from $1 billion to about $500 million, then that's one way of liberalizing access, because then it makes it equitable and available and affordable. So I think those are the kind of 3 pathways we can look at.
The other group I think we're letting down are the Lilly and Lees of this world, who have got rare tumour types, and yet never going to have large randomised clinical trials worldwide, and you have active molecules, and it's taking a long time to get them access for those patients to those drugs, and there probably needs to be an alternative system for rare tumour types to get ready access to patients, and in my country reimbursement for those agents so that people don't have to pay for them.
Can I also just say, just to build, I mean, I remember that statement, and I mean, there's a huge problem in Nigeria on basically poor quality counterfeit medicines, and that is something that the regulators are having a very hard time in the country to get a handle on, and it is critical to drive access, because that will make it easier to prevent these fake poor quality medicines.
Very quickly, I mentioned before that we've been seeing progress in how the local agency Anvisa has addressing clinical trials overall. And I remember when I was in the pharmaceutical industry 10 years ago, it was very difficult. I think the biggest issue was really the capabilities held in the agency to be able to deal with complex protocols, complex trials. So we've been working together with the government to build up those competencies, and I would say it has improved. It has improved a lot. Industry has supported the government in this aspect, and ended up that 5 years ago, Anvisa has joined a network of the 6 most prominent agencies in the globe. And of course, this has been fastening up. At the same time, we are somehow, let's say, under the approvals of FDA and MAA. So there is still a learning curve to go, but it has been slowly but surely improving.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip the second question because I want to give the group a chance to ask questions. We have just a couple minutes before lunch. Any questions from the audience in attendance? Everybody's hungry. I guess it's lunchtime. Okay, so maybe the best thing, I want to thank the fantastic panelists and thank everyone for attending. And we will continue these discussions over lunch. Thank you all.